The snow had begun to fall over Newport when the invitation arrived, an embossed card sealed with the mark of a man who owned half the city and believed he could own her too. On Christmas Eve, in a world gilded with deception and whispered promises, Addison Caldwell must choose between silence that protects her family and truth that could destroy them all. Behind every dance, every smile lies a secret, one powerful enough to shatter the illusion of society's glittering perfection. Tell us where you're listening from, what city, what cozy corner, and answer this. When love and honor collide in a period romance, which would you choose, the truth or the illusion? Newport, Rhode Island, December of the year 1888. The sea murmured in the distance, its breath cold and relentless against the stones of the Caldwell cottage, where frost clung to the window panes like lace spun by ghosts. Inside, the fire crackled low in the hearth, casting golden shadows on the worn floral rug and on the hem of Addison Caldwell's plum-wool gown, which brushed the floor as she crossed the room with measured steps. She held the envelope as if it might burn her fingers, heavy cream-colored paper engraved with gilt letters. Her name, etched in swirling black ink, rested above the seal of the Black family crest, a coal-fired phoenix clutching a crown in its claws. The scent of ink, wax, and winter roses clung faintly to it, as though it had passed through a world untouched by smoke or struggle. The Christmas Eve ball, the announcement of her engagement to Victor Black. She read the words again, though she had memorized them at first glance. Her breath left her slowly. Behind her the tea kettle whistled. A quiet voice, soft as linen folded in a cedar drawer, called from the adjoining parlor. "Addie, is it from him?" Addison turned to see her younger sister, Lila, stepping into the room, her face flushed from the fire's warmth and the excitement in her chest. She looked almost childish in that moment, despite the pale powder-blue dress she wore, the one with the mother-of-pearl buttons and the quilted silk jacket she'd insisted on mending herself. Her cheeks were pink, her chestnut hair pinned up with a trembling hand. She had tried, earnestly, to become the image society expected. Addison nodded, slipping the card back into its envelope with the grace of someone concealing a blade. "Yes," she said, "it's from Victor." Lila clapped her hands together, then stopped, sensing the tension in her sister's jaw. "He's making it official, then. On Christmas Eve. That's a display," Addison interrupted gently without bitterness. But expected. The silence that followed was not heavy, only delicate, as though the wrong word might shatter something fragile between them. Lila lowered her eyes and twisted the edge of her sleeve. "I think it's romantic." Addison smiled faintly. "Of course you do." She did not add that Lila had not yet stood long enough in the smoke of society's drawing rooms to know how quickly the shimmer of romance could turn to ash. Outside, the wind howled like a forgotten song. The cottage, though small and battered by salt and years, stood firm against it. Its old beams, as reliable as the woman seated in the rocking chair near the fire. Grandmother Eleanor's hands, lined with time and memory, moved rhythmically as she knitted something in soft grey yarn. Perhaps it was a shawl for Lila, or a blanket for one of the many children the women of the town sent to her for comfort when they had no other place to go. She did not look up as she spoke, but her words carried a weight Addison always recognized. "Tell me, Addison," she said, her voice like parchment warmed by firelight, "do you want this marriage?" Lila froze. Addison did not. "I want what's best for this family," she replied evenly, but her throat tightened as she said it. Eleanor gave a slight nod, neither approving nor condemning. She merely acknowledged the truth and the cost of it. Victor Black had been many things to Newport: patron, businessman, benefactor. He had donated a conservatory, sponsored a winter orphanage, and lined the pockets of more than one alderman. But beneath his gleaming exterior was coal, compressed, combustible, and buried deep. The Caldwell name still carried a whisper of former wealth, but the estate had been gone for 5 winters, and Eleanor's small inheritance had stretched thin across years of illness and survival. Victor's offer had arrived like a lifeline, albeit one tied tightly around the neck. Addison placed the invitation on the mantel, where it stood upright between a faded daguerreotype of her parents and a sprig of dried lavender. "I'll wear the garnet silk," she murmured. Lila's eyes lit up. "It's perfect. You'll look like one of the angels from the church windows." Addison laughed softly, not unkindly. "No one at that ball is looking for angels." A gust of wind rattled the shutters. Lila crossed to the small window and peeked through the frosted glass. Bellevue Avenue shimmered in the distance, gas lamps gleaming like golden eyes, mansions adorned with garlands and ribbons. The world beyond the cottage was gilded, enormous, waiting. But here, inside the firelit hush, reality settled between the women like a fourth presence. Lila spoke again, softer this time. "You could grow to love him." Addison did not answer. She moved toward the armchair and knelt beside their grandmother, taking the ball of yarn from her lap. The thread unspooled between their fingers, old hands and young ones tangled in something fragile, something necessary. Outside, snow began to fall in gentle silence. The invitation gleamed in the dimness, the ink catching the firelight just enough to whisper its demand: appear, smile, obey. Addison stood and drew her shawl around her shoulders. "Yes," she whispered, "I suppose I could." But in her chest, something fluttered, small and defiant. Not love, not hope, a question. And it refused to be silenced. The morning air was crisp and sharp, with the scent of sea salt slipping through the shutters like an old memory. The Caldwell cottage, nestled at the edge of the rocky shoreline, seemed to breathe in quiet rhythm with the tide. Inside, light filtered through the lace curtains, soft and gold, illuminating the modest parlor, where Addison Caldwell sat beside the sewing basket, threading a silk ribbon through the collar of her sister's new gown. The powder blue wool, newly delivered from the dressmaker, still bore the scent of starch and rosewater. The fabric gleamed faintly in the light, and beside it, resting atop a folded lace chemisette, lay a small object that had not been there before. A prayer book. Not unusual, perhaps. Addison herself had one, plain, leather-bound, well-worn at the edges. But this one was not Lila's. It was too ornate, covered in blue velvet with silver claspwork and tiny amethysts embedded along the spine. It was the kind of devotional gift offered by a man of means to a girl he wished to flatter without scandal. The kind of thing Victor Black might place in a box wrapped in silk. Addison's fingertips hovered over it before she picked it up. The cover felt cool, heavier than expected. When she unfastened the clasp and turned the first page, a thin sheet of folded paper slipped from between the psalms. It floated soundlessly to the floor. She stared at it for a long moment. It was not addressed. The paper was fine linen, creased twice. A name signed in swift, unmistakable script, Eliza Hart, M.D., brought a sudden pressure to Addison's chest. With careful hands, she unfolded the note. The message was brief, direct, clinical, condition confirmed. 8 weeks, possibly 9. Recommend complete discretion. If arrangements are needed, I remain available for further consultation. E.H. Addison read it once, then again. The words did not change. They struck her, each one, like a small crack in a stained glass window. She could see the image, whole, proud, illuminated, but it would not take much more to break. Her breath trembled as she folded the note again with aching precision and slipped it into the pocket of her skirt. In the next room, Lila hummed a carol softly to herself, her voice light as snow brushing the eaves. Addison pressed her hands to her temples and closed her eyes. There was no signature on the recipient line, but there didn't need to be. Addison stood. The shawl she reached for was her grandmother's, grey wool trimmed in fading black lace. She wrapped it around her shoulders without a word and crossed the parlor, her boots clicking lightly across the floorboards. Eleanor glanced up from her armchair, her knitting momentarily forgotten. "Are you stepping out, child?" Addison turned, already at the door. "Just for a little while," she answered. "I'll be back before lunch." Eleanor said nothing more, but her eyes followed Addison as she slipped out into the cold. The wind along the coast cut with sudden sharpness, but Addison did not feel it. Her mind moved faster than her feet, which carried her through narrow lanes and past stone walls blanketed with ivy and frost. Her fingers clenched around the note inside her pocket as she reached the modest clapboard building on the edge of the West Square, the home and practice of Dr. Eliza Hart. The sign was discreet, hand-carved and aged by sun and salt. Addison knocked once and waited. The door opened almost immediately. Dr. Hart stood in the entryway, her dark eyes alert behind her pince-nez glasses. Her olive skin bore the fatigue of long nights and quiet burdens. She did not speak until she had looked Addison over entirely, noting the expression in her face before stepping aside. "You read it," she said. Addison nodded. "I have questions. Come in. The parlor is empty." The doctor led her through the narrow hall, past curtained rooms that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and old paper, to a small sitting room lined with shelves of anatomy books and medicine vials. A fire crackled in the corner. Tea waited in a silver pot, but neither woman reached for it. "Tell me," Addison began, keeping her voice steady. "Was it a mistake?" Dr. Hart sat, folding her hands in her lap. "No." "Then tell me plainly. It's Lila." A pause, then a nod. "She came to me last week. She was frightened. She asked for secrecy." "She's 19, Addison whispered. 19, and still speaks to the cat as if it were a priest. She sleeps with her Bible beneath the pillow." "She also wept when she said his name," the doctor replied gently, "and then begged me not to tell you." Addison closed her eyes. The fire snapped behind her, as if the truth had made the air combust. She rose and walked slowly to the window, where the frost crept along the corners of the pane. She touched it absently, watching it melt beneath her warmth. She didn't even understand what he'd done, did she? She believed he would protect her, that there would be a promise, that no one would have to know. Eliza's voice was soft, but steady. "I've seen it before." "Victor Black," Addison said, the name like ash on her tongue. "He bought her a prayer book." Eliza's eyes narrowed. Then he knew exactly what he was doing. Addison turned. Her pulse pounded in her throat. "She's barely a woman." "He knows that." The doctor's hands tightened around the arms of her chair. "They always do." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was not empty. It was full of betrayal, of clarity, of something unspoken rising slowly like floodwater. Addison crossed the room and sat, hands folded in her lap, knees pressed together to keep herself from unraveling. Her voice, when it came, was low. "I am to announce my engagement to him at the Christmas Eve ball." Eliza blinked slowly. "Then this is more than a betrayal." Addison gave a brittle smile. "This is a sentence." She stood again, unable to sit still. "What are the risks?" she asked. "Is Lila, well? She is physically fine, for now. She is exhausted, emotional and ashamed. She does not yet understand the danger he put her in. That shame does not belong to her." Addison nodded. Her gaze drifted toward the fire. "She has always loved snowfall," she murmured. "She used to press her face against the window pane and pretend it was angels falling." "I should have known. I should have—" "No," Eliza said firmly. "You are not to carry his sin." Addison turned back to her, and her voice was hollow now. "Then what am I to carry?" The doctor did not answer. Instead, she rose and handed Addison a second note, blank, but for the header of her practice. "When you decide what you wish to do, write to me. I will support whatever choice she makes. But she will need you." "I'm not sure I can protect her," Addison whispered. "You can," Eliza said, "because you already are." Outside, the sky had shifted, turning pale with the weight of clouds. The first snowflakes began to fall, slow, drifting, innocent. But inside Addison Caldwell, something had already begun to break, and in the space where it broke, something fiercer began to form. The days that followed the snow's arrival settled over Newport like a sheet of glass, beautiful, cold, and perilously thin. The city shimmered beneath frost and garland, its chimneys breathing slow spirals of smoke into the pale sky. Horses trotted stiffly over cobbled streets, and footmen in fine livery lined the entrances of marble mansions, preparing for holiday receptions that reeked of pine and performance. But on the quieter edge of the coast, in the Caldwell cottage whose paint had faded to a softened grey, the atmosphere had turned taut, as if something unseen had wound itself around the beams and corners, and was waiting, listening. Addison had not spoken to Lila directly. Not yet. The note from Dr. Hart remained locked inside her writing desk, folded with such precision it might have passed for an unsent letter. Every time Addison reached for it, her fingers withdrew, not from fear, but from sorrow. It was Eleanor who noticed first. The elder matriarch sat in her high-backed chair by the hearth, her knitting needles moving slowly, thoughtfully, as if translating the air around her. Her white hair, tucked beneath a lace cap, shimmered with each flicker of firelight. "You're walking with a shadow at your heel," she said one evening without lifting her eyes, "and you keep putting on your gloves without going anywhere." Addison, startled by the sudden truth in the remark, looked down at her hands. The kid leather gloves lay folded in her lap. She hadn't even noticed she'd picked them up. "I've been thinking," she replied. Eleanor set her knitting aside. "Thinking is a quiet form of suffering, my dear. It's the noise inside that you're trying not to let out." Addison hesitated, the words rising, but not yet ready. She crossed the room and stood beside the window, where condensation blurred the view of the sea. Outside, the snow had hardened to a brittle crust along the garden path. "She's been tired," she said finally. "Lila, she's been quiet," Eleanor corrected gently, "and she's always been bright when she is hiding something." Addison turned. "You've seen it too?" "I'm old, not blind," Eleanor said. Her voice, though soft, carried the finality of stone. "And you're waiting to break the silence because you know once it's broken, nothing will be simple again." Addison sat slowly in the chair across from her grandmother. The firelight washed her face in gold and shadow. "I want to protect her," she whispered. "Then you must begin by believing her," Eleanor replied, "even if the truth breaks your heart." The silence between them was no longer oppressive, it was sacred. That night, Addison found her sister curled up beneath a patchwork quilt in the small bedroom they had shared as girls. The window was slightly cracked, allowing the salt of the sea to mingle with the lavender sachet tucked beneath the pillow. Lila's eyes were open, wide and glistening, though she did not stir when Addison entered. "You're not sleeping," Addison said, though it wasn't a question. Lila shifted and sat up. Her braid had unraveled in sleep, and the loose waves of chestnut hair framed her pale face like the petals of a closing flower. "I've been dreaming too much," she said softly. "When I sleep, I forget how things are." Addison crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed. She did not reach for her sister's hand, not yet. The distance between them felt sacred, and she had to honor the choice Lila hadn't yet made. "I found the prayer book," she said. Lila's lips parted. The color drained slowly from her face. "I didn't mean for you to see the letter," she whispered. "It wasn't meant for you." "Who was it meant for?" Lila's hands twisted in her lap. "I don't know anymore." Addison waited. She let the silence stretch, gentle but firm, like a hand offered rather than imposed. Lila's shoulders trembled. "He said I was different, that I understood him, that most women only loved his name, not the man." Addison's jaw tensed, but she kept her voice even. "Did he promise you anything?" "A cottage," Lila said, barely audible. "He said he would give me a cottage near the edge of his estate, that no one would have to know. That once we were after the wedding, everything would be right again." A tear slid down her cheek. Addison caught it with the back of her knuckle. "And you believed him?" Lila nodded. "I wanted to. Addison inhaled slowly, the ache blooming through her chest like cold through stone. "Did he ever hurt you?" she asked. Lila shook her head, her hands tightening. Not in ways that show, but he never asked if I wanted. He just said it would happen, that it was natural, that we were meant to be joined in every way. And I thought, if I said no, he would turn away, and I didn't want to be abandoned. Addison's hand found hers then, and she squeezed it with trembling strength. "You were never meant to carry this alone," she said. They stayed there for a long time, the two of them, hearts beating in the same rhythm again for the first time in weeks. When Lila finally lay back down, Addison remained by her side, her hand resting lightly atop her sister's. The next morning, the world outside seemed unchanged, but Addison was not. She dressed with care, charcoal grey skirts, a burgundy wool coat with high buttons, and a hat pinned firmly over her coiled hair. She walked into town beneath skies heavy with snow and soot, determined not to blink. That afternoon, at Victor Black's downtown office, Addison entered with the grace of a woman in command of her fury. She did not confront him, not yet. Instead, she observed, Victor stood at the head of a table lined with city men, businessmen, aldermen, clerks with eyes too eager. He laughed easily, threw coins to beggars with calculated charm, and spoke of charitable opportunities with a tone so polished it shined. Addison stood in the corner, her gloves still on, listening. "The donation to the Carmichael home will be doubled this year," Victor was saying, "though I trust their matron will remember to remove that troublesome girl before the new year." A murmur of amusement passed through the room, and as for the young Miss Rawlings, I hear she's settled in Chicago now. Praise discretion. Addison's breath caught. Miss Rawlings. Carmichael home. Discretion! This was not the language of generosity. This was the choreography of cover-up. When he noticed her, Victor's face lit up with that well-trained smile, the one polished for society columns and drawing rooms. "My darling," he said, crossing the room with the confidence of a man who had never known consequence. "What a surprise!" She let him kiss her gloved hand. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "I thought I'd watch you work," she said smoothly. "It's always enlightening." He laughed, but something in her voice made him glance twice. Addison remained only 10 minutes more, just enough to confirm what she already knew. Her sister was not the first, and unless something was done, she would not be the last. She stepped back into the wind, her coat drawn close, and walked home alone. The snow was falling again, thin, sharp, like whispers turned to blades, and every step she took cut deeper into the house of lies she was determined to bring down. The snow had thickened by morning, blanketing the rooftops of Newport with deceptive serenity. It softened the edges of the city's sharpest corners, shrouding the marble facades and iron gates of Bellevue Avenue in white silence. But Addison Caldwell felt none of its calm. Beneath her wool cloak, something colder churned, a quiet, exacting resolve that pulsed like ice beneath her skin. She stood before the heavy glass doors of the Harrow and Black building, an imposing structure of white stone and black wrought iron, rising like a monument to ambition. Its gold-lettered sign gleamed even through the snow, and footmen flanked the entrance like statues in uniform. She gave her name quietly and was ushered inside, her boots leaving delicate wet imprints on the marble floor. Victor Black's private office was on the top floor, where the air was warmer and the ceilings arched high above rows of velvet drapes and crown molding dusted with gold leaf. The waiting room was silent, save for the ticking of an ornate clock shaped like a Grecian temple. Addison's gloves were still on, her hat firmly pinned to her low chignon. She sat for only a moment before a secretary, a young man too eager, too polished, escorted her into the Lion's Mouth. Victor's office was designed to impress. Dark mahogany walls rose around her like a theatre set, lined with oil paintings of shipping vessels and grand industrial skylines. A crimson Persian rug stretched beneath a desk the size of a dining table, behind which Victor stood, arms spread, as if greeting a favored guest. The windows at his back framed a breathtaking view of the harbour, frozen and glinting beneath the winter sun. "Addison," he said with his most radiant smile, "you honour me." She paused just inside the doorway. Her heartbeat was steady now, measured like her steps. "I asked for privacy," she said. "And you shall have it," Victor replied, gesturing toward the velvet chair before his desk. "No one disturbs me when that door is shut." She did not sit. "I won't be long." He chuckled as he returned to his chair, crossing one leg over the other. He wore a tailored frock coat of deep navy, his waistcoat glinting with a subtle diamond pin. Even his cravat, precisely tied, seemed calculated to signal benevolence and power. Only his eyes betrayed him, amber and calculating beneath the mask. "I assumed you were here to discuss the ball," he said, folding his hands. "Or perhaps the necklace? I've taken the liberty of having your grandmother's garnets reset." "I'm not here for jewelry," Addison said. Her voice did not tremble. Victor's smile faltered, just enough for her to see the hinge. "I see." He leaned back, studying her. "Then to what do I owe this intensity?" Addison approached the desk slowly, every movement deliberate. She withdrew a folded paper from her cloak and placed it on the polished wood surface between them. Victor didn't reach for it. "What is this?" "A letter," she said, "from Dr. Eliza Hart." That name, spoken aloud, stripped the room of its warmth. The change in Victor was subtle. His fingers twitched before folding again. His eyes narrowed, though the smile remained in place. He still did not touch the letter. "You've been speaking with physicians?" he asked lightly. "I have," she said. "Because my sister is with child." A beat of silence. Victor exhaled through his nose, as though disappointed by an employee or mildly inconvenienced by the weather. "I see," he said at last. "So that's what this is about." Addison tilted her head slightly. "That's what you think this is about." Victor rose from his chair and walked slowly toward the wide window behind him. His silhouette was haloed by light, a portrait of respectability. But she saw the tension in his shoulders, the careful slowness of his steps. "She is a sensitive girl," he said after a pause, "easily misled, romantic." "She believed you," Addison said. "She trusted you. And now she is ruined in the eyes of the very society you pretend to protect." Victor turned, his voice suddenly sharpened. "You speak of ruin as though it's a crime I committed. Do not be naive, Addison. This happens every day. Women misunderstand, become attached." "She is 19, Addison snapped, the mask cracking just enough for her fury to flash through. Victor blinked. That smile was gone now. "She is my sister, and you preyed upon her innocence with promises you never intended to keep." His voice lowered. "Then why are you here? If this is your grand moral indictment, why bring it privately?" Addison drew in a slow breath. "Because I'm giving you a choice." That intrigued him. He returned to his chair, eyes narrowed. "I'm listening." "You will provide for her," she said, "discreetly, permanently, without condition or insult. She will not be sent away. She will be cared for medically and financially, and you will step away from this engagement quietly, without public humiliation." Victor laughed. It was not a joyful sound. "Do you think I would allow you to turn this into a bargain?" "It's not a bargain," Addison said coolly. "It's the only path I'm willing to leave untarnished." Victor leaned forward. His voice was silk over steel. "And if I refuse," Addison met his gaze, "then I will show that letter to men whose reputations you do not own." He stared at her, the tension thick as frost in the air. "You have no proof," he said. "I don't need proof to ruin you," she replied. "I need doubt, and a woman's word." Victor's smile returned, but it was tighter now, almost bitter. He leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming on the desk. "You're bold," he said. "I admire that." He opened the drawer of his desk and removed a folder. Inside, crisp papers lined with columns of numbers and names. "I've made arrangements before," he said, for situations like this. He slid one of the pages toward her, a ledger of names, coded entries, dates. Charitable housing, medical relocation. These are the words that keep society intact, Addison. You don't destroy men like me. You inherit us. Addison looked at the page but did not touch it. And you've done this before. He gave a slight shrug. I don't keep count. She reached into her cloak again and removed a small envelope. Inside it, the ledger's cover page, copied discreetly by a sympathetic clerk she'd spoken to at City Records just that morning. I don't need all of it, she said. Just this. She placed it in her bag with deliberate care. Victor rose again, slowly. You're playing a dangerous game. Addison turned to the door. Not a game, Victor, a reckoning. She paused just before leaving. Tell your secretary I'll not be attending the ball. I find I no longer have a reason to dance. With that, she walked out, past the statuesque secretary, down the marble stairs, and out into the snow-covered street. The sky above her was white and endless, the wind biting at her cheeks, but she felt a strange stillness inside. Not peace, but clarity. As the door shut behind her, she knew this was only the beginning. The snow did not stop. It fell in steady veils from a sky the color of pewter, coating the stone lanes of Newport with a deceptive hush. The city moved beneath it in muffled rhythms. Carriages slower, voices quieter, windows shuttered earlier. Yet inside the Caldwell cottage, silence was never empty. It was layered with meaning, echoing down the hallways like the memory of something once said, but never forgotten. Addison sat at her writing desk near the hearth, the sleeves of her garnet wool dress pushed up to the elbows, her hands dusted with graphite from the ledgers she had been reviewing. Her eyes burned from strain, but she would not stop. Numbers did not lie. They could be traced, followed, held like smoke in the palm if one knew how to look. And she was learning. A knock at the door roused her. It was late in the afternoon, and the light had turned golden behind the lace curtains. Eleanor looked up from her chair, where she had been darning one of Lila's winter shawls. Addison rose swiftly, straightening her skirts before opening the door. The man who stood on the front steps was not tall nor imposing, but there was something in his bearing that spoke of solidity, of still waters and well-tempered iron. Jonathan Reed removed his hat with quiet respect, snow still clinging to its brim. "Miss Caldwell," he greeted with a low, steady voice. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Please," Addison replied, stepping aside. "Come in out of the cold." He entered with careful steps, removing his gloves and brushing snow from his shoulders. Eleanor offered a brief, assessing nod from her chair before returning to her work, her presence dignified but unobtrusive. Jonathan removed a leather folder from beneath his coat and laid it gently on the table. "I've reviewed the pages you copied," he said. "You were right to be suspicious. There's a pattern, a very old one but consistent. Funds labeled as charitable endowments, housing stipends, and medical sponsorships. But the recipients listed are not affiliated with any institution I recognize." Addison nodded slowly. "Because they're not. They're women." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "Yes, paid to disappear." The words lingered, sharp as a broken bone. He sat when invited, his presence quiet but steady, like the ticking of the clock above the mantel. Addison watched him with growing respect, not because he spoke often, but because when he did, he never wasted breath. "They call it charity," she murmured, "but it's bribery dressed in silk." "It's more than that," he said. "It's coercion, a silent economy of shame. I've represented women like your sister before, though few with family brave enough to stand with them." Addison's eyes lifted to his. For a moment, nothing was said, but in the space between their gazes, something passed. Recognition, resolve. "I need your help," she said plainly, "not only to protect Lila, but to ensure she is not forgotten, buried beneath a name no longer spoken." Jonathan nodded. "Then we'll begin by following the money. Not just the page you brought me, but every name attached to that account." He opened his folder and began laying out records. Faded invoices, clipped notices from society columns, handwritten testimonies from 2 former staff members who had worked in Victor Black's estate over the past 5 years. The notes were discreet, anonymous, but damning in their consistency. "He prefers women who won't be believed," Jonathan said. "Servants, orphans, girls from families, one scandal away from collapse." "Then Lila was a perfect target," Addison whispered. "Not anymore," he replied. She glanced at him, her breath catching slightly at the way he said it, not as a lawyer, not even as a friend, but as a man who had seen too much cruelty to ever mistake silence for consent. Behind them, the kettle began to whistle. Eleanor rose, her movements slow but assured, and poured tea for the 3 of them, her silver-spun hair gleaming under the lamplight. She placed a cup in front of Jonathan without a word, then another before Addison. Before she returned to her chair, she laid a hand on Addison's shoulder, a silent gesture of approval, firm as a benediction. That evening, after Jonathan departed with a promise to return the next day, Addison found Lila seated by the small upright piano in the back parlour. The girl's posture was slouched, her fingers hovering uncertainly above the keys. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and old sheet music. Hart had visited earlier and suggested Lila begin light movement again. No strain, just something to reconnect her body with gentler rhythms. "Play something," Addison said, stepping into the room. Lila glanced back. Her cheeks were pale, her eyes shadowed, but she managed a faint smile. "I don't remember anything by heart anymore." "Then remember something with your hands," Addison said. "The way grandmother taught us. Let your fingers find it." Lila exhaled slowly and let her fingers drift downward. The melody that followed was soft, uncertain, but real. A lullaby, one their mother used to hum while brushing their hair by firelight. A song without words, only feeling. Addison sat beside her, not speaking. She did not need to. For several minutes the house breathed music again. That night, as the wind rattled the shutters and sleet began to fall in fine sheets across the roof, Addison sat again at her writing desk, copying another set of entries from the ledger. Her hands moved with precision, but her mind wandered to the man who had sat in their parlour, his voice steady, his eyes unwavering. Jonathan Reed did not carry wealth or charm the way Victor did. He did not glitter, but he carried something else, a quiet gravity. A decency that held the room together without demanding attention. She remembered the way he had looked at her, not with pity, not with admiration, but with understanding, as though he saw not only what she had done, but why it had cost her to do it. And somehow that steadied her more than any vow ever could. She dipped her pen again and continued her work, the lamplight casting golden halos over ink and paper. In the cradle of the storm, justice began to take shape, not in courts or crowds, but in the quiet defiance of a woman who refused to let her sister be erased, and in the slow, meticulous efforts of a man who believed that truth, once uncovered, could be a kind of redemption. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the future began to right itself. The snow in Newport no longer fell gently. It came now in thick, wind-driven sheets, slanting across rooftops like lashes from an invisible hand. Even the bells of Trinity Church, so constant in their Sunday discipline, seemed muffled beneath the weight of winter. But not all sound had been silenced. That morning, the society column of the Newport Herald rang louder than any chime. Its ink still fresh, its tone giddy and final. Miss Addison Caldwell to wear heirloom garnet necklace at Christmas Eve ball, confirming engagement to coal magnate Victor Black. The words curled across the page like smoke. Beneath the bold headline, a brief mention of Eleanor Caldwell's storied lineage, the modest but noble traditions of the family, and, most importantly, the anticipated union of wealth and dignity that society so adored. The article concluded with a note on the necklace, a Victorian heirloom of remarkable craftsmanship, said to have been worn by Eleanor herself at her coming-out ball. Addison stared at the print in silence. She sat in the window alcove of the back parlour, still in her morning robe, the cup of untouched tea cooling in her hands. The paper trembled, not from her grip, but from the fury that bloomed beneath her calm. Victor had not spoken to her of this. Not a word. And now he had the entire city expecting a performance she had no intention of giving. Eleanor folded the newspaper and set it aside with a disapproving sigh. "He has gone too far," she said. Addison did not answer. She rose instead, walked to the hearth, and pressed her hand to the worn wooden mantel as if grounding herself. "It's a claim," she murmured, "a mark of possession. He wants the world to see me wrapped in garnet, a ruby-red seal of compliance." Eleanor's gaze, sharp despite the decades behind it, found her granddaughter's. "You are not an ornament," she said, "and that necklace is not a chain." Addison turned, her voice low but steady. "No, but I'll wear it if I must. Let them watch me shine. Let them see what he thinks he owns." That afternoon, she made her way through the snow to Jonathan Reed's office, her cloak pulled tight, her cheeks flushed by cold and conviction. The building stood unassuming on a narrow street, lined with bare-limbed trees. Inside, the warmth smelled faintly of ink and old wood. Jonathan was waiting. His dark grey waistcoat had a button undone, his sleeves rolled back to reveal wrists ink-stained from hours of transcription. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment his entire face softened, not with surprise but with recognition, as though she were not a visitor but someone returning to a place she had helped build. "You saw the announcement," he said quietly. "I did. I expected a reply in fire." "I brought something better," she replied, slipping a folded parchment from her bag. "It's time we file the preliminary affidavit." Jonathan studied her expression, then nodded. "I'll draft it tonight." They sat together for over an hour, the room filled with the rustling of paper, the scratch of pen against page, and the slow, deliberate building of a case no one would expect, but none could ignore. Addison had never imagined she would find strength in ink. But each name they transcribed, each date and transaction buried in Victor's ledgers, brought a strange and solemn power to her fingertips. This was not revenge. It was preservation. Not only of Lila's dignity, but of all the women who had vanished behind Victor's velvet curtain of generosity. And it was during one of these meetings that Addison first heard her name, Maggie, a former maid at the Black Estate, quiet, loyal, invisible, until she had been quietly dismissed under the vague claim of illness. She now worked in a boarding house for seamstresses, owned by a widow who kept no questions and burned no bridges. Jonathan had tracked her with the precision of a man who did not chase rumors, but collected facts. "She's agreed to speak," he told Addison that evening. "Not publicly, not yet, but privately to us. She has a copy. A copy of the ledger? Of one of them. She knew it might matter someday. She was threatened, you see, and frightened. But she was also clever." Addison leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "And she kept it? In the lining of her sewing basket." Addison felt a chill, but not from the wind. "Then she is the crack in the dam," she said. "If we protect her, others may follow." Jonathan nodded. "We must be careful. Victor will sense movement soon." Outside, the snow thickened again, clinging to the windows like frost-bitten lace. Back at the cottage, the fire was low and the air heavy with the scent of cinnamon bark. Lila sat curled in an armchair, her feet tucked beneath her, a small ball of pale blue yarn resting beside her. In her hands, 2 ivory needles worked slowly, awkwardly, to shape the beginning of a sleeve, tiny, delicate, for a life not yet seen. Addison watched from the doorway, unnoticed. Lila's face was lit softly by the flame, her mouth slightly parted, her brow furrowed not in worry, but in concentration. The garment was imperfect, loose in some rows, too tight in others, but it was real, and it was hers. "You should sleep," Addison said gently, stepping inside. Lila looked up, startled. Then she smiled. "It calms me," she said. "The rhythm, the sound." Addison sat beside her. For a moment neither spoke. The fire cracked. The wind sighed against the window panes. "Dr. Hart says the child is healthy," Addison said at last. "She said your heart sounds strong. The rest will follow." Lila nodded, but her hands had stilled. "I dream about him," she whispered. Addison stiffened. "Not in longing," Lila said quickly. "In dread. Sometimes I'm back in that room, and I can't leave. The walls are velvet, and the doors have no handles." Addison reached out, brushing her fingers lightly across Lila's hand. "He'll never touch you again," she said, her voice low, firm. "That's not a hope. That's a vow." Lila looked at her then, truly looked. There was something in her sister's face she had not seen before. A fire that did not burn bright, but deep. "What will happen when they find out?" Lila asked softly. "The others, the papers, the women at church." Addison swallowed. "They will talk, and they will judge." Lila's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "But I will not be ashamed," she said, "because I was misled, not broken." Addison leaned forward and kissed her forehead. "You are braver than you know." That night, as the storm thickened and the world beyond their windows blurred into white, Addison sat once more at her desk. She removed the garnet necklace from its box and laid it on the parchment beside the ledger entries. It gleamed with ancestral beauty, each stone warm, red, royal. She studied it for a long time, then she dipped her pen into the inkwell and began to write, her script fluid, unwavering. Each word she etched was a declaration, each line a boundary drawn in steel, and above her the snow kept falling, quiet, constant, pure, as if the sky itself were offering absolution, or waiting for the moment when everything that had been hidden would at last be seen. The wind changed first. It came with a low groan from the sea, rising through the skeletal trees, twisting around chimneys and eaves, as if the air itself had taken on a warning. By midday, the sky had surrendered to a leaden hush, and by dusk, snow began to fall. Not the soft, drifting kind that settled gently over rooftops, but sharp, slanting flurries driven by a force that seemed to come from some unseen hand. The nor'easter had arrived. Inside the Caldwell cottage, the warmth of the hearth did little to soften the tension that had taken root in the walls. The fire snapped, its glow flickering against the silver-threaded lace curtains, but no one sat beside it. Addison stood at the parlour window, watching the sky darken over the harbour. The storm was claiming the town inch by inch, casting Newport in a veil of white that blurred lamplights and swallowed sound. Her reflection in the glass was pale, almost spectral, dark eyes, lips set in contemplation, a silhouette wrapped in her grandmother's shawl. Behind her, footsteps approached with measured grace. Eleanor Caldwell, dignified even in her slippers, crossed the room with the slow determination of someone who had outlived 3 husbands and buried more dreams than she ever dared to speak aloud. In her hand, she held a small velvet box, the garnet necklace resting within like a wound encased in velvet. Addison turned. Eleanor did not speak immediately. She simply placed the box on the side table, her fingers lingering on the lid before letting it go. "I always knew it would come to this," she said, her voice low and steady. "Not the storm outside, the one you've been holding inside your eyes." Addison's breath caught, but she said nothing. Eleanor moved to the armchair and sat with a quiet sigh. "I was younger than you when I learned what men could take and still call it love. I wore that necklace to my debut. It was supposed to mark the beginning of a life. Instead, it became a burden, passed down through women too proud to cry and too wise to hope." Addison crossed the room slowly, each step weighed down by the unsaid. "I never wanted to involve you. You never had to. You carry your pain too loudly in silence, child." Eleanor looked up. "Tell me, all of it." And so Addison did. She spoke of Lila's trembling confession, of Victor's threats dressed in velvet, of Maggie's courage and the ledger hidden beneath layers of shame and dust. She spoke of the affidavits signed in Jonathan's quiet office, and the names of women buried beneath words like donation, relocation, charity. When she finished, the wind howled against the window, but the room itself held its breath. Eleanor leaned forward and opened the velvet box. "You will wear it," she said. "Not because he expects it, but because it belonged to me, and to my mother, and her mother before her. You will wear it as we should have worn it, like armor." Addison looked down at the garnets, deep red, almost black, like blood beneath water. She reached out and touched them, and for the first time they felt neither heavy nor cruel. They felt earned. Outside, the storm thickened. Ice laced the corners of the windows, and the wind's voice grew harsher, as though the sky were tearing itself open. Elsewhere in the city, another confrontation unfolded. Victor Black paced the drawing room of his private estate, his cravat loosened, his eyes narrowed. A decanter of brandy stood untouched on the sideboard. Before him, Maggie stood still, her gloved hands folded in front of her, her eyes lowered but not afraid. "You're mistaken," Victor said, his voice deceptively calm. "No one is accusing you of anything. I simply want to ensure your loyalty, that's all." Maggie did not answer. Victor stepped closer. "There are consequences, you know, for theft, for betrayal." She looked up then, her voice soft but firm. "There are consequences for men like you too." His jaw clenched. "You think they'll protect you? That widow of a lawyer and that bleeding-heart socialite?" Maggie remained still. "They already have." Victor took a breath, then waved a hand, dismissing her like a servant from his presence. "You may go. But if I find you've shared anything beyond your place, I will make sure you vanish into more than just footnotes." She turned without a word and walked out into the snow. Her footprints disappeared behind her almost instantly. Jonathan met her 2 blocks away, waiting with a lantern beneath the arch of a church portico. He helped her into a waiting carriage, the horses restless beneath their blankets. "You'll be safe in Providence," he said. "A friend of mine runs a boarding house near the port. She knows everything." Maggie gave a small nod, her breath visible in the air. "I never thought I'd be believed." Jonathan looked at her gently. "Sometimes all it takes is one woman who refuses to stay silent." She blinked hard, but said nothing more. Back at the cottage, Addison stood in her bedroom, the fire casting shadows across the walls. The garnet necklace lay upon the vanity, its stones catching light and throwing it back like secrets reflected in glass. She unwrapped the tissue around her gown. It was not new. It had been Eleanor's once, then altered by a seamstress with careful hands and eyes that did not ask questions. Ivory silk fitted at the bodice, with sleeves that floated just below the elbow and a train that whispered across the floor like memory. Addison lifted it to her frame and looked at her reflection. Not a debutante, not a bride, a woman armed with truth. Later that night, as she braided Lila's hair beside the fire, the storm roared outside, bending trees, rattling windows, howling across the sea. But inside, the house held strong. "You're really going to do it?" Lila said softly. "In front of them all." Addison nodded, her fingers still weaving. "Not for spectacle, for clarity." Lila closed her eyes. "Will they hate you?" "Maybe, but they'll listen." Lila opened her eyes again and turned to face her sister. "Don't go alone." Addison smiled faintly. "I won't." And in her chest, beneath the garnet stones and the lace and the silence that had shaped her, a voice stirred. Her own. Waiting not to scream, but to speak. To name what no one else dared name. Outside, the nor'easter screamed through the streets, tearing ribbons from lampposts and shaking the confidence of even the oldest mansions. But within the heart of a woman, the storm had already passed. What remained was the truth, and it was unmovable. The Hargrave estate stood like a palace carved from frost and ambition. On Christmas Eve, its windows gleamed with candlelight, and every lantern outside the gates blazed through the snowstorm as though daring the heavens to extinguish them. Footmen in livery, The colour of deep wine stood at attention while guests arrived in sleighs and carriages lined with sable. The cold was biting, but inside the world burned with opulence. Music from a full orchestra soared through the ballroom, violins cascading like champagne over crystal and silk. The walls were dressed in garlands of pine and gold ribbon, and chandeliers dripped with light, casting a glow over hundreds of faces powdered and flushed beneath towering coiffures and brilliant tiaras. Laughter floated like perfume. Every eye sparkled with expectation, and at the center of it all was the man they had come to honor. Victor Black moved through the crowd like a conquering general, his hand resting lightly on the shoulder of one banker's wife, then clasping a senator's palm with practiced warmth. He was resplendent in his evening tailcoat, his white bow tie immaculate, a single red carnation blooming on his lapel like blood against snow. Tonight, he was the story, the engagement, the future, only he did not yet know that his chapter was already ending. Addison Caldwell arrived alone. The door opened just as the orchestra began a new waltz, and for a moment the room stilled, not in silence but in the quiet recalibration of 100 glances. She wore ivory silk. The gown fit like memory, shaped with understated elegance, a boned bodice that curved to her waist, elbow-length sleeves trimmed with fine lace, and a train that glided behind her like a sigh. Around her neck gleamed the Caldwell garnet necklace, deep crimson stones that caught the firelight and shimmered like heartbeats. Her hair was gathered in a regal twist, a few dark curls escaping to soften the lines of her face. She wore no gloves, no jewels in her ears, and no smile, only resolve. She crossed the ballroom as if it were a courtroom, each step precise, silent, unhurried. Her presence sliced through the layers of perfume and expectation like a blade through silk. People parted for her without understanding why. Something in her carriage warned them not to speak. Victor saw her then from across the room, and his face lit with a politician's joy. Bright, performative, hollow. "My dear," he said, approaching with a glass of champagne in hand, his voice loud enough to carry. "You are the breath of winter itself." Addison inclined her head slightly. "Good evening." He gestured to the orchestra. "We've saved a dance, you know. They're waiting." "They won't have to wait long," she replied. Victor's eyes flickered just briefly, a warning bell, distant but present. He turned and raised his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called, voice lifting above the music. The room fell into a hush. "I thank you all for gathering on this most blessed of nights. Christmas Eve has long been a time for family, for tradition, and for the future." A gentle murmur of approval swept the ballroom. Victor smiled. "And it is with pride and gratitude that I announce the formal union of two legacies, one forged in fire and industry, the other rooted in dignity and heritage." He turned to Addison, lifting his glass toward her. "To Miss Addison Caldwell, soon to be Mrs. Victor Black." There was a pause, a beat, an intake of breath. Then Addison stepped forward. She did not take the glass. Instead, she reached into the velvet pouch tucked discreetly at her side and withdrew a folded paper bound in a pale blue ribbon. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was clear. "I will not marry Victor Black." A ripple of confusion passed through the room, sharp and immediate. Victor's smile faltered. "Addison." She held up a hand, silencing him without touching him. "I do not make this announcement lightly. I understand the gravity of such a moment. And yet there are truths that outweigh tradition, dignity that cannot be purchased by title or dowry." Her gaze swept the room, not angry, not pleading, but resolute. "Some of you have accepted donations from Mr. Black. Others have praised his generosity. But generosity without transparency is only vanity and finer clothing. And silence when tied to gold is not charity, it is erasure." The guests shifted uncomfortably, eyebrows arched. Fans paused mid-flutter. Victor's face darkened. "You're making a scene." Addison turned to him, her eyes steady. "I'm revealing a pattern." She unfolded the paper. "In this document, and in others like it, are records. Records of payouts to women who were made to disappear. Women whose only offense was believing the wrong promise. I will not name them. I will not shame them. But their absence is felt, and their voices deserve space." Someone gasped. A society matron clutched her pearls. A senator whispered to his wife. The orchestra, unsure, trailed off into silence. Addison continued. "I was to be the next page in that ledger. I was to wear this necklace," she touched the garnets, "as a symbol of status, not strength. But I will not be remembered as a wife to cruelty wrapped in civility." Victor stepped toward her, voice low and sharp. "You've ruined yourself." She turned to face him full. "No," she said. "I have freed myself." The ballroom, so accustomed to spectacle, had never seen a silence like this. Not the hush of boredom or etiquette, but the stunned stillness of truth echoing in marble and glass. From the back of the room, a woman stepped forward. Mrs. Caledonia Shaw, a widow of vast influence and unimpeachable reputation. She said nothing, but walked to Addison's side and placed a gloved hand gently on her arm. A subtle, elegant alignment, one that changed everything. Whispers spread like wildfire. Victor looked around, suddenly smaller in the brilliance he once commanded. Addison offered a final nod and turned, her skirts whispering as she walked away. Not hurried, not shamed, but radiant in the space she had claimed. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft and relentless. A carriage waited by the steps. Jonathan stood beside it, coat dusted in white, eyes locked on the ballroom's great entrance. When she emerged, he did not speak. He opened the door and helped her inside, his hand lingering at her elbow. As they drove away from the gilded house, neither looked back. The chandeliers behind them still blazed, but something had gone dim inside. For the first time in a long while, Newport's silence felt honest. And in that quiet, a woman had spoken the truth, and been heard. The morning after the ball, Newport awoke beneath a sky of brittle blue. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the city stunned and gleaming. Snowdrifts lined the cobbled streets like sculpted silence, and icicles clung to wrought-iron balconies as if the houses themselves held their breath. Chimneys puffed gently in the winter sun, and the only sound for a time was the measured crunch of boots across powder. Inside Eleanor Caldwell's cottage by the sea, warmth bloomed against the frost. The fire crackled low in the hearth, casting long golden shadows on the floorboards. On the parlour table, a folded copy of the Newport Gazette lay unopened, its headline discreet but unmistakable. "Betrothal ends amicably. No comment from Black Estate." Addison sat beside the window, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her gaze tracing the horizon where snow met sea. Her hands rested in her lap, still folded, neither triumphant nor trembling. Outside, the last icicles dripped their final tears. The sky was sharp with clarity. There had been no spectacle in the press. No mention of ledgers or settlements, no allusions to scandal or shame. The article had been tucked between shipping news and a recipe for molasses cake, but the silence, polished and controlled, was louder than a scream. Victor Black's empire, it seemed, had learned how to bleed quietly. Across town, behind closed doors, conversations had begun. He had tendered his resignation from the board of the Children's Charitable Society that very morning, citing personal reflection and retreat. A luncheon he was scheduled to host at the Redwood Library had been indefinitely postponed. Rumours floated, soft as snowflakes, about a deal with the Havens Shipping Consortium that had crumbled overnight, investors withdrawing without explanation. In parlours and banking rooms, people smiled and said nothing. The silence was eloquent. At the cottage, life pressed forward in gentler ways. Lila, wrapped in a quilt Eleanor had sewn in her youth, sat at the upright piano in the back room. Her fingers moved across the keys like someone relearning a language once spoken fluently in childhood. The melody was simple, scales, arpeggios, a half-remembered lullaby, but her hands were steadier now. Dr. Eliza Hart sat beside her, not as a physician today, but as a guide. Her notes were few, her encouragement quiet, and when Lila paused, eyes brimming, it was not with sorrow, it was with relief. "I didn't think I'd ever touch music again," she whispered, not looking up. "You never stopped," Dr. Hart replied. "It was waiting for you." From the doorway, Addison watched her sister, a swell of quiet pride rising beneath the ache. Lila's cheeks had gained colour in the past week, and her voice no longer faltered when she spoke. She had begun knitting again in the evenings, soft bonnets and tiny socks, each stitch a declaration that life would go on. That shame had no place here. Eleanor remained vigilant. She oversaw the household with a dignity that belied her frailty, rising each morning to steep tea and remind the world that the Caldwell name meant more than marble and manners. At night, she would sit beside Lila and share stories from decades past, her voice weaving warmth into the firelight. "We've survived worse," she'd say, eyes glittering, "but we've never been prouder." It was on the third afternoon after the ball that Maggie appeared. She came by foot, wrapped in a plain wool cloak, her bonnet dusted with snow. Addison answered the door herself, surprised to find the young maid on the step, cheeks flushed from cold and something else, something like courage. "I didn't want to leave without saying thank you," Maggie said. "You've nothing to thank me for," Addison replied gently. "I do," she said, voice trembling. "No one ever stood up to him. Not for girls like us." She handed Addison a small envelope. "This is for Mr. Reed. He'll know what to do with it." Inside was a neatly folded receipt for a storage rental outside Providence. Addison recognized the handwriting. Victor's. Maggie looked over her shoulder once, then offered a smile so small it nearly vanished. "I work at the shelter now," she said. "We keep the windows open, so no one has to knock." Addison watched her disappear down the road, the snow welcoming her footprints. That evening, Jonathan Reed arrived with a satchel of papers and a loaf of still warm bread from the baker on Mill Street. He brought no grand speeches, no bouquets, only a calm presence and ink-stained hands. Eleanor welcomed him with a knowing smile and retreated to her room with a candle and a novel. In the parlour, Addison poured them both tea. He declined sugar, as always. They spoke of ledgers, of testimonies filed anonymously, of a young woman in Chicago who had come forward after reading the story in a regional column. Her name would remain private, her voice now part of something larger. "I brought something else," Jonathan said after a while, his tone softer. From his coat pocket he withdrew a smaller envelope, this one pale blue, embossed with a delicate silver crest. Addison unfolded it carefully. Inside were notes from a court filing, the dissolution of certain assets, the withdrawal of funding from compromised institutions, the redirection of trusts to shelters and recovery homes. Most bore no signature, only initials, J.R. "You're using the law to build something new," she said, eyes scanning the documents. He met her gaze. "I learned from you." Outside, snow had begun to fall again. Soft, slow, unthreatening. The storm had passed, but the season lingered. Jonathan reached into his satchel one last time and produced a small velvet box. Addison inhaled sharply, the instinctive reaction of a woman raised in a world where boxes like that contained answers already decided. But he did not open it. "I don't want you to decide anything tonight," he said. "I only want you to know that hope has many forms, and that sometimes it waits in quiet places." She reached out and rested her fingers atop the box, not to open it, not yet, but to acknowledge it. The silence between them stretched, golden and full. "I'm not ready," she whispered. He nodded, not disappointed. "I didn't ask you to be." In the next room, Lila played a lullaby. Eleanor's laughter drifted down the hall. Somewhere beyond the trees, church bells began to ring out the hour. Addison stood and moved toward the window. She pressed her palm to the glass and watched the snow land softly on the earth, layer by layer, as if covering the past, not to bury it, but to make room for what might bloom beneath. She turned to Jonathan, her voice steady. "Stay a little while." And he did. Not as a rescuer, not as a suitor, but as a man who had seen her stand in the fire and walk through it with her name intact. That night, the hearth burned low, and the wind outside had softened to a sigh. For the first time in a long while, the world did not feel like a place to escape, but one that might, just might, be lived in. 12 months had passed since the ballroom lights dimmed, and the chandeliers fell silent. Now, on another winter's eve, warmth shimmered from every window of the cottage perched above the sea. The world outside was hushed beneath a fresh blanket of snow, but within, the hearth glowed, the candles flickered, and laughter rose in gentle waves. The air was steeped in pine, cinnamon, and the sweet tang of citrus simmering in mulled wine. Garlands of cedar twined around banisters and mantelpieces, threaded with ribbons of cranberry red. In the parlour, holly branches and paper stars hung from the ceiling on lengths of twine. It was not the grand display of Bellevue Avenue, nor the glittering parade of society homes, but it was radiant, alive with sincerity, handcrafted joy and love that had survived the fire. Leela sat curled on the settee near the hearth, her cheeks flushed from the heat, and a soft smile playing on her lips. A single silver hairpin kept her dark curls in place, though a few strands had slipped free. She looked every inch the woman she had fought to become. No longer the delicate girl drawn into shadows, but a mother, a musician, a soul made whole. In her arms slept a child swaddled in knitted wool, his chest rising and falling in perfect peace. His fingers curled gently around the edge of the blanket, his brow smooth, his lips parted in a soft, milky sigh. The infant bore traces of both mystery and miracle, a life carved out of chaos and carried forward by fierce, quiet love. Addison Caldwell, older now but as sharp and luminous as ever, stood behind them with one hand resting lightly on Lila's shoulder. She watched the baby, as if he were made of glass and starlight, a living thread, binding past and future. "He looks like your father did as a child," she murmured, voice full of old memories and new pride, "except this one will grow up without secrets pressed into his ribs." Lila smiled up at her, eyes shining. "He will grow up with music and stories and women who will teach him what kindness means. And courage," Eleanor added. "Don't forget that." In the kitchen, the scent of bread rose as warm rolls cooled on a cloth-covered tray. The table was laid for supper, modest but abundant: roast duck, mashed turnips, stewed apples, a cranberry tart shaped like a star. By the window, snow drifted past the panes in lazy spirals, the world softened by winter's hush. Addison stood apart from it all for a moment, her hand resting on the window frame, her posture still. She wore a gown of deep midnight blue, simple but elegant, trimmed in jet beads that caught the candlelight when she moved. Her hair was swept up in a soft chignon, a single garnet pin glinting like a buried ember at its base. She looked out into the dusk, where lanterns flickered along the path, and the sea, invisible now in the darkness, whispered just beyond reach. She had not worn her grandmother's garnet necklace since the night she refused to become someone else's ornament. And yet tonight, a different jewel shimmered in her gaze, one carved not from opulence, but from purpose. Behind her, the door creaked open. She turned, already knowing it was him. Jonathan Reed stepped into the room carrying a small velvet box in one hand and a folded paper parcel under his arm. His coat was dusted with snow, his cheeks ruddy from the cold, and a familiar smile hovered at the corners of his mouth, the kind that said he was exactly where he wished to be. Addison walked to him slowly, her steps deliberate, not hesitant. He removed his hat and set it aside, his eyes never leaving hers. "I thought you might be busy," she said softly, though her smile betrayed no real surprise. "I was," he replied, "finishing something." He offered her the box, not with flair, not with expectation, but with quiet reverence. She took it, glancing at him, then down. It was not heavy, and when she lifted the lid, there were no rings or brooches, no glittering stones. Instead, nestled inside were letters, sketches, and a deed. The topmost paper bore her name. She looked up, confusion and awe dancing across her features. "It's a house," Jonathan said, voice hushed. "In town. Modest. Warm. Meant for women with nowhere else to go. Built with what he tried to take, and what you refused to give him." Addison stared at the papers, her fingers trembling slightly. "You built this in my name?" "I built it because of your name." The room quieted. The fire hissed softly. Somewhere in the parlor, Lila began to hum a lullaby. Eleanor's laughter drifted faintly from the kitchen, joined by the sound of a teacup resting on a saucer. Jonathan reached for Addison's hand, cradling it between his palms. "I didn't bring this tonight for a promise of anything," he said. "Not a vow, not a decision. I brought it because everything you are deserves to be made into something real, not just for one woman, but for many." Addison looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped closer, until there was no space left between words and breath. She pressed her forehead lightly to his, her hand resting gently on his chest. The moment held no spectacle, no applause, only truth. And when she pulled back, her eyes glistened not from triumph or defiance, but from peace. "You never asked me to choose you," she whispered. "No," he said, "but I hoped you'd choose yourself." She nodded once, slowly. "I did." Church bells tolled in the distance, clear and solemn, ringing out the hour and the closing of the year. Addison walked to the door, the velvet box still in her hand. She opened it and stepped out into the snow. The cold kissed her cheeks, but she did not shiver. The wind carried scents of salt and pine, and above her the stars began to emerge, one by one, as if the sky too had learned how to begin again. Jonathan followed her, his boots crunching behind her. Side by side, they stood beneath the winter night, gazing not at the past, but at the road ahead, quiet, uncertain, unglittering, and real. And as snow began to fall once more, soft and steady, Addison Caldwell let out a breath she had been holding for years. The future belonged to her now, and she would meet it not with silk gloves or borrowed jewels, but with bare hands, clear eyes, and a heart that no longer needed permission to hope. The sea had not changed. It still whispered to the rocks below the cliffs, its voice rough in winter, tender in spring. Snow still kissed the eaves of the cottage, and the pines still leaned toward the wind, like old men listening for stories in the cold. But within those walls, life had changed in quiet, extraordinary ways. It was a mild winter day, unseasonably bright. Inside the now familiar cottage, a fire glowed in the hearth, and in a chair upholstered in faded rose velvet, Addison Reed sat with a letter in her lap and a baby at her breast. She was older now, not aged, but softened at the edges, as if time had smoothed her into someone even more herself. Her hair was pinned simply, her gown warm and practical, and the garnet pin, once a symbol of silent survival, now rested in a drawer, replaced by a locket with initials etched inside. The child in her arms, Clara Eleanor Reed, suckled gently, one hand curled against Addison's collarbone. She was a solemn baby, dark-haired and watchful, with eyes the color of winter storms. From the next room, laughter rang out. Lila's son, now 5 years old, chased a ginger cat down the hallway while singing an off-key rendition of a carol. He had his mother's dimples and his aunt's defiance. Lila herself followed close behind, flushed and giggling, her belly rounded again with new life. She was married now, not to a man of fortune, but to a quiet schoolteacher who loved poetry and never raised his voice. Dr. Eliza Hart visited often. She was now matron of the newly expanded women's hospital funded by the town's anonymous trust. the one whose cornerstone bore Addison's name in fine script beneath the motto, "Mercy without silence." Maggie worked there too, a senior clerk with a new last name and a wedding band she wore without apology. Her story had become testimony, and testimony had become reform. Victor Black had vanished from headlines. The collapse had been slow but irreversible, an avalanche of scandal couched in euphemism. His properties were sold, his influence eroded. Rumour had him living abroad, clinging to what remained of a name too tarnished to restore. He had paid the highest price a man like him could face: irrelevance. But justice, Addison had learned, came in many shapes, some loud, some quiet, all final. Jonathan entered the room just then, snow on his coat and a satchel of documents under one arm. He was still the same. Steady eyes, kind mouth, hands worn not by wealth but by use. But there was something deeper in him now, the peace of a man who had chosen right over easy again and again. He set his things down, leaned over, and pressed a kiss to Addison's temple. She leaned into him without a word. Outside the window, the sea glimmered in the distance, pale and vast. On the mantel sat a framed sketch of the town's shelter, now 3 stories high, home to widows, girls, and working mothers. The original deed remained in a drawer beside birth certificates and family recipes, no longer needed but never discarded. As the clock chimed noon, Eleanor's chair remained empty, but not forgotten. A photograph of her, seated by the fire in the final year of her life, watched over the room with a gaze still sharp. Her garnet necklace had been donated to the Historical Society, where it rested behind glass, labelled "The Last Jewel of Bellevue Avenue." The plaque did not name Addison. That was her choice. She did not need monuments to remind her of what they had survived. As the baby stirred in her arms, Addison rose and walked to the window. Outside, the trees were bare, the garden dormant, but in the flower beds lay seeds, planted by Lila's son just before the frost. Tulips, if the earth was kind. Jonathan came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "You wrote to Boston?" she asked, nodding toward the letter on the table. He nodded. "They'll publish the article, a full account, no redactions." Addison closed her eyes. 5 years ago she would have trembled at such news. Now she felt only quiet conviction. The truth had roots, and roots outlasted storms. Down the hall, the laughter began again. Footsteps pounded, the baby cooed. Addison looked at her husband. "We're not who we once were." "No," he said, "we're more." The bells from the chapel in town began to ring. The same sound that once marked endings, now marking days filled with beginnings. Addison opened the door to the porch and stepped out, cradling Clara close. The air smelled of pine and ocean salt. Snow fell in soft spirals around her. The future, it turned out, was not something glittering in the distance. It was here, in her arms, and for the first time it did not frighten her. It called to her with the gentleness of falling snow and the strength of all that had been built, not from gold, but from truth. She stepped forward. The story had ended, but her life was only just beginning. What a journey! Addison's story is not just about betrayal, scandal, or the grandeur of gilded ballrooms. It's about the quiet, relentless strength of a woman who refused to let shame speak louder than truth. It's about choosing justice over appearances, dignity over silence, and love. Not the kind wrapped in diamonds, but the kind built day by day, in the small acts that no one applauds but everyone remembers. If this story touched your heart, if you found yourself holding your breath in the ballroom or smiling softly on the snowy porch, then you are part of this world we're building. Leave a comment with the word "Garnet" so we know you were with us until the very end. Your presence means more than you know. If you wish to support the team behind these emotional, historical romances, consider sending a super thanks. Any amount you choose helps us keep telling these stories with the care and beauty they deserve. And if a contribution isn't possible right now, no worries at all. Simply sharing this video with someone who loves period dramas is already a beautiful way to help. And don't forget, we've left a few more unforgettable romances waiting for you in the cards above. Each one holds its own world of heartbreak, hope, and healing. Thank you for watching, and for believing, like Addison did, that truth and love are always worth choosing, even when the world says otherwise.